I thought that it was important to have a conversation about the national security implications of coronavirus. Joining me today in this call, we're going to have a conversation with Congressman Trent Franks from the great state of Arizona. I'm pleased because this is my first formal video conversation with our distinguished, the Gold Institute's distinguished fellow, and this is going to be the first of many. I've spent many years working with the congressman when he was on Capitol Hill and focusing on a whole host of things, and some of which actually we're going to touch on today. So this is a great opportunity, and I thank you for joining me. Congressman, thank you. And Trent Franks is truly a Reagan conservative, which is very interesting because believes in limited government, but yet peace through strength, and that's something that we will discuss today because I certainly want to get your take on that. He's a man of true conviction. At over 6 feet, stood tall and strong to represent those with limited ability to fight for themselves in Washington. Fought diligently, was probably the most vocal for those member of the House of Representatives over the 15 years there that to protect the unborn. Also fought diligently during his tenure to fight for those who have, let's just say, a limited voice in Washington. For example, the Kurds in Kurdistan over a centralized Baghdad, something that Trent Franks spent years fighting for our true allies. The congressman has served on the House Judiciary Committee and was chairman of the Subcommittee on Constitutional and Civil Justice, something that may have gotten lost over the past 3+ years. So this is going to be very interesting. Also, and most important, specifically for this conversation, served on the House Armed Services Committee and serving as Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee and the vice chair of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee. Chaired the International Religious Freedom Caucus, again, something that I think President Trump has touched on with regards to aid, financial aid during this coronavirus, really touched to hit and to help the religious institutions in the country, and also chaired the Missile Defense Caucus, which is again extremely important for today's conversation. So again, thank you for joining us today.
Well, I think I need to consult with you to have you write my obituary or something, Ellie. Make it sound pretty good, buddy.
Before we begin, let's just give, if you can, take 30 to 60 seconds. Just give us your perspective on the coronavirus, how it's being handled here, maybe versus what you see globally. President Trump doing good job, poor job by comparison to others, and so on.
Well, the truth is, I think the president is doing a very good job. You know, the inevitable politics of it, and I'm certainly not immune, as you know, Ellie. I'm a conservative Republican, and so sometimes that puts me in the position of having no choice but to push back against some of the left nonsensical ideas that pervade the Democrat Party today. So I guess I just start out and be very open about my bias in that regard. I think it's a bias born out of reason and foundational truth, but nevertheless, it's quite pronounced in my case. And I think the left has done everything they can to exploit this horrific tragedy for political means, and it is just an unconscionable thing that they do. And having said that, I suppose it shouldn't surprise any of us that they do all that they can to try to make the president look bad. But it's ironic, you know, that when he called for the travel ban related to China, he was roundly criticized for something so dramatic. And of course, it's always some racist foundation that's causing this, as they usually articulate, and which nothing could be further from the truth, but that's what they do. And now, of course, his wisdom in that regard has proven very sound. One of the great challenges that Italy had was that they had a lot of influx right directly from Wuhan, and it created a base for that terrible virus to spread quickly. So to capsulize, I think the president, in the face of enormous odds, has done extremely well in this situation. And I think we would have had a far greater tragedy had someone else been president.
You have this unique ability of explaining certain things that many people cannot. So I think this is great. Let's take a look at what's happening today. You know, with the coronavirus and the financial assistance that was passed in Congress and signed by the president. And I'm not even talking about all the extra additional spending that was in there, things that really don't belong. You were in Congress for 15 years, and I'm confident that if you were there for another 15 years, you still wouldn't be able to explain to me why we can't have a piece of legislation that just answers the question. And here we could have had legislation without giving $25 million to the Kennedy Center, even though they received that money, they still had to laid off people. So it's very difficult to really understand that. But let's put that aside as a fait accompli. It's just is what it is.
Well,
but my question to you is I am not thrilled about a $2.2 trillion bailout or assistance program. I think it's just way too big. What should be the solution? I'm not 100% sure. And then if you add what the Fed has done, which is another I'm sorry, I said billion, I meant trillion. And if you add another $4 trillion as the Fed has done, that's a $6.2 trillion assistance program. And I'm not even questioning President Trump right this moment, but how does a Reagan conservative such as yourself and myself reconcile this versus spending almost $1 trillion on our defense budget? How do we reconcile that?
Well, it's pretty hard. You know, a lot of people, I think, rightfully suggest that the ancillary impact of COVID on the potential heading this country into some sort of a depression or some sort of a major recession could take an awful lot of lives in and of itself. And I believe that to be true. And so it's a pretty frightening scenario that we're dealing with here. Our society's reaction to something sometimes can be as complex and as impactful as the substance of the problem itself. As I said earlier, I believe that Donald Trump has done a good job in trying to prevent the widespread of this virus. And I think that his detractors have done so not so much on the basis of policy, but on the basis of perceived political gain. And but I am very concerned as to what will be the economic outlay here, and what will be the new landscape of the economy after this thing backs off. And I do see at least signs that it is backing off. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I won't try to get into some of the more technical reasons. I think that we will gain some herd immunity to this virus that is pretty common with most viruses, but I think the fact that we've responded so well may compromise even that to some degree for next flu season or the next time that this virus might make a comeback. So there's a lot of concern, but right now I think it's very, very important that we realize that as a nation, if we're not productive, not only can we not defend ourselves, not only can we not provide for ourselves, but we cannot in the long run even fight this virus. We have to be a productive nation. Sometimes, you know, our brilliant economists are able to articulate the economy in some highfalutin way. You know, they perpetrate monotonic, polysyllabic obfuscation, semantic gymnastics, and verbal circumlocution on us, and we don't know what they're talking about.
Sure.
But the truth is, economy is about productivity. And in responding to tragedies, we have to maintain our base productivity, or it would be, you know, bad in the long run on all fronts.
Right. So it's a very interesting scenario, something that we haven't really seen before with a response as large as it is today. I mean, listen, I think that people ask me, what do you think about President Trump's response? And I say, this is fantastic. Never in our history, to the best of my knowledge, have we had the public-private partnership when responding the way the president has. And quite frankly, even the testing, if with previous administrations, if we would have relied all of our testing on the CDC, well, while we want everybody in the country should be tested, maybe yes, maybe no, right? Imagine if we relied only on the CDC lab to do all the testing. We wouldn't be able to cover that. But even today, by bringing in the private sector labs, the private labs, in conjunction with the CDC, our capabilities are that much greater.
Well, that's right. And you know, whatever case they try to make against Donald Trump, no one could make any reasonable, even scintilla of a case against him on the basis of being lackadaisical. He has been very proactive. He has been very out front, very in the cutting edge of this at all times. And one might, you know, say, well, was this the best thing to this, or was this the best thing to do? But you cannot suggest for a moment that he has stood by and let things happen. Whereas our previous president was famous for that. I mean, vacillation was his middle name. And so this president has been very proactive. And you know, in the final analysis, we'll probably see some of those things were maybe not the best use of our productivity as a nation. I don't know. I don't really predict that one way or the other because it's just unknown. But the truth is, President Donald Trump has been extremely proactive, and the world should be grateful to him for that. And I think in the long run, we're going to learn a lot of things from this virus, and we're going to learn a lot of new ways to be productive. I just pray that somehow we can get past it. And I absolutely am convinced that we will discover a vaccine. But, you know, that's not the end all. Right now, you know, flu is now killing, regular flu is now killing about 3 times the number in this. Say if you went from January 1st to February 1st, flu has killed about 3 times as many people as COVID. Right. And we have a vaccine for flu. I find that to be of consequence. It's not so much juxtaposing flu against COVID. And COVID is a more virulent virus than flu or influenza A, and it is certainly has more devastating implications than flu. So, not to compare the two at all, but when you add up the lives lost, and then you juxtapose that against the fact that flu has a vaccine, it's something of great substance to consider. And this president has reacted in, I think, a very significant way, and he's done a good job.
Now, let me just shift here slightly, because what we have seen over the years, and you even during your time in Congress as well, is the question of influence that other actors have on social media, or via social media. The left has, for the longest of time, and by the way, I believe to some degree there was some influence there, but whether the Russians had influence through social media on our elections, I mean, this is something, quite frankly, that every country does on some level. I mean, President Obama spent how much money in Israel trying to influence the elections?
Exactly.
We had no problem with that, but I'm not sure if it's because it was President Obama or because it was Israel. or maybe both. I don't know. We had no problem with that. But the question becomes, as we look at our economy, and this is quite, and I'm going to say it's quite devastating to our economy. How much of this do we have to be concerned that maybe the Chinese influence on this is making our reaction a little bit worse and more devastating than it could be or should be?
Well, I certainly think that the Chinese government is culpable for literally deceiving the world body on the significance of the virus and what they were dealing with, and some of its genesis. There's no doubt in my mind about that. And perhaps the reason that this virus has gained so much attention is partly because of the new age that we live in of social media. I don't doubt that for a moment, and it is a factor of great consequence. There's no question about that. However, this virus, once it causes infection, has a much more ominous impact than standard influenza A flu, because there seems to be, and I'm my background's engineering, not medicine, but there seems to be an indication, and I put this forward advisedly and with great caution, and not endorsing it, but suggesting that I'm hearing that a lot of the death that is caused by this virus may be somehow connected to the immune system's response that creates an inflammatory response and then catalyzes a syndrome that leads to a pneumonia-like condition where the lungs fill with fluid. And it's not the standard pneumonia. This is something that is catalyzed by the immune system itself, an inflammatory response to the immune system, and that makes it unpredictable. And that's probably why this virus scares us so much, is because we just don't know as much about it as we do the others. But in terms of actual death, we do know. And when you have these other things, it's just important to keep it all in perspective. Because what is it? You mentioned about the flu virus, that we've gotten used to it. I forget the gentleman that said it. He said, but vice and evil was so frightening and mean that to be hated needs only to be seen, but seen too often with its familiar face, first we endure and then we pity and then we embrace.
Right.
The point is, it's not an exact illustration, but it points out that we as a human family have the tendency to grow used to particular issues, and then they don't frighten us anymore. But I mean, cancer kills probably 2 million people. At that same time, I mentioned that between the 1st of August, the 1st of January and the 1st of April, we probably saw 2 million cancer deaths in the world. We saw 10 million children aborted before they were born in that same period, when we saw less than 50,000 COVID deaths, less than 150,000 flu deaths. So it's important to keep this bigger picture in mind. And I was especially, maybe that is a case that is very illustrative. The governor of New York, Governor Cuomo, said to the effect that we do not accept the premise that human life is disposable. Well, I couldn't agree with him more. But how can a man who just signed a bill that would allow abortion up to the moment of birth make
Right.
such a statement with a straight face? This is the thing that always astonishes me about the left, is that they are so double-minded and so willing to twist the truth, or really to try to deceive people to the extent that we forget what the real battle is. And we're always trying to find out who's right rather than what's right. And as a people, we have to reject the situational ethic and try to find out what's right together for the sake of everyone.
Well, so let's go back to the question, though, and I think that, and you're 100% right, and I wasn't comparing the viruses medically, but the question is, knowing the impact that this virus is having on our economy, on the country as a whole, are you at all concerned? Let's rephrase the question, I guess. Are you at all concerned about the influence that our less than allies may have on this on the country? In other words, because I'm looking at this purely from a defense perspective. I am not looking at this from the health perspective. I'm not looking at it from an economic perspective. I'm looking at this purely from a defense perspective, because there are a whole host of issues that you and I are going to talk about now. What is the impact just on the surface? In other words, let's take this social media impact that we've come to accustomed to talk about. You know, from the elections all the way through today, what impact, if any, do you believe now that these other countries may say, you know, this is a good prime opportunity to influence? You know, we can also talk about the grid. What is a threat in our you know, somewhat diminished state right now, or preoccupied state. Let's word it that way. Some of our preoccupied state. What type of threat do we have to our grid? Let's just say from an EMP, something that you chaired the EMP caucus. And I know that you and I have had many conversations talking about many pieces of legislation and so on. What are some of the threats that we have to be concerned about? Because what I'm looking at, you know, the Golden Super for international strategy, we focus on defense and foreign policy. That's what we focus on. And as a country, while some may say, how can you be talking about this when people are dying from COVID, is quite the opposite. This is when we need to be talking about it. Now, there are some organizations that focus on healthcare and so on, which they should be focusing on, but you don't hear people necessarily, or too many people, when you turn on the news. I don't care whether it's Fox News, OAN, or CNN and MSNBC. You don't hear people talking about the threat that we now face. So these are some of the things that I want to talk about with you. Is let's shift gears from the medical side and let's look at the defense side. So I want to hear what your thoughts are.
Well, first of all, you brought up several subjects of profound significance, and I couldn't agree with you more, Ellie, that national security is the first responsibility of any government. I mean, what price does one put on national security? That is life and death for the citizens and the nation itself. It is vital beyond words, and we need to always be concerned about that. And as one of the founding fathers said, you know, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And that is certainly true today. We have to be one step ahead of our adversaries, or certainly there will be consequences in the long run. And I would agree with you that China and Russia, other, you know, I'll call them opponents right now rather than enemies. But in the long run, we should recognize them as potential enemies that would, if they could, subordinate the United States and vitiate our freedom completely if it was in their power to do so. And we must make sure it never is. You know, China, through quantitative, some of their fiscal policies and their monetary policies related to currency and things of that nature, have done everything they could to try to let's say compete with America, but they've done everything they could to suppress our economic success. And Russia is the same way. There's always an effort on the part of our major peer competitors to try to gain the advantage economically. And I think one of the most frightening things that we should be considering is that the fact that China now has drawn almost parity in terms of GDP with the United States of America. Now, I've been talking about that for years on the military side, in that they have about 20 times the number of defense engineers as the United States does, and that essentially they have a very workable process to where they steal a lot of our best technology, and then rather than to build out the particular technology of the moment, like we have to do in order to make it pay off, in order to make it to sustain it. In other words, if we were to build say the M3 Abrams tank, the new tank that I hear is potentially on the drawing board. If China is able to steal those plans from us, they don't build the M3. They take that technology and they try to leap forward to the next generation, And then they've beaten us on two fronts. And it's simply by virtue of the fact that they have no scruples as to what they steal. And unfortunately, we're not careful enough about what we allow them to steal. And we, our left-wing friends consider that there's no real difference in the American philosophy and the Chinese philosophy of humanity and government. And so we have to be very vigilant in that regard. China, when I was on the Strategic Nuclear Forces Subcommittee, China was gaining a qualitative edge on us in space when it came to critical defense technologies. And some of us were jumping through ourselves. At the same time, the left was just, well, you know, we shouldn't weaponize space. And I thought, well, that's a fine thought, but China is in the process of not only doing it, they have done so. And we have held back because of this concern that we might be juxtaposing or suggesting that our American ideology or our American philosophy is superior to that of the Chinese philosophy. I'm just going to say, like Ronald Reagan, it is. The American ideal is a very important ideal. It holds that all of us are created equal and that we're endowed by not government, but by our Creator with those great unalienable rights that all humanity so desperately needs. And we need to defend that as Americans, because it's not just, it's not just a nice ideal for the world.
Sure.
It's vital for American survival in the long run.
What do you see is China's thought process when it comes to an attack on the United States? Let's just use. We're going to talk about China, but we can also talk about Iran. We can also talk about Russia. But let's say, you know, if China were if China were to use an EMP right now to attack our grid, it doesn't necessarily have to affect the entire country. It could be somewhat localized, or regional. Let's put it that way.
Right, regional is the best. Mm-hmm.
Is there any? First of all, without a doubt, the use of anything such as an EMP by China or a hypersonic weapon by Russia, or drones by Iran, would be essentially a game changer. A game changer. That would be the equivalent of using a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
That's a game changer where, you know, our relationship has changed. Putting that in perspective, how concerned are you? And again, you chaired the EMP caucus. How concerned are you that another state actor might use this as an opportunity to take some action against the United States?
Well, there's a lot of questions there, but you pointed out one very critical concept, Ellie, and that is what should be our policy related to some type of an EMP attack or something along those lines. You know, the big debate in England here a few years ago, I used to head the World Summit on critical infrastructure security, and they had some of their major leaders, very wisely in my opinion, suggesting that England should declare an EMP attack on England as a nuclear attack, because it was designed to literally put England at risk. Now, England is different in that their nuclear armament is based on their submarine technology. Now, they don't have land-based missiles like we do. And if you ask them, you know, when they point out their nuclear deterrent, they show you a picture of the ocean, so you never know where they are.
Right.
But the reality is that these types of attacks should be considered strategic attacks, and we should respond ahead of time so that we don't have to respond tactically. Right. And so I completely agree with you. You know, EMP is unique in that now a country like North Korea has the potential to deliver a major EMP strike on the United States of America. They have missiles which can range the United States. They don't need a reentry vehicle like we would need for, say, a warhead attack. They don't need really the kind of advanced telemetry for aiming or guidance. That they just need to get it just in the general ballpark and detonate they demonstrated that they can detonate a 200 kiloton warhead already, and then they turned around and threatened us and said that we have the power to to attack the United States with electromagnetic pulse. Now, there's only two components to any threat when it comes to military of great significance. There's a lot of components, but there's only two that really should be considered deeply and carefully, and that is the capacity of an enemy and the intent of the enemy. When North Korea demonstrates their capacity clearly and then telegraphs their potential intent, we should listen to that.
Right.
This president has done so. I had the privilege of sponsoring the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act in Congress, and it passed. And then a year and a half later, something along those lines, the President of the United States, President Trump, it'd be about a year later, I guess, President Trump issued an executive order on EMP, and it's a brilliant order, and it's something that has caused great movement in our country to protect at least our critical defense assets.
What was the order? What was the order that the president?
It was the order on protecting the critical infrastructures of the United States.
Okay, so what did that help?
Sometime about spring of last year, I believe, and it's important that now that they put the kind of leadership in implementing that executive order in place, because
So
Obama.
Just for people listening, what did that order say? It said to put in our critical infrastructure. What does that mean?
Basically said that we need to implement the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act on an expedited basis and a focused basis, which would harden our electric grid. That'd be one of the components of that, hardening our electric grids so that we would not be so vulnerable to EMP. Because right now, if you're a North Korea and you just mindlessly want to strike out at the United States, if you know that you potentially have a kill shot, that'd be their language, not mine, sure. Against the United States, then, a twisted mind might be inclined to proceed. And it has great implications for us. If they know, on the other hand, that we've hardened our grid and that we can survive, say, a 200 kilovolt EMP attack, then all of a sudden they're not so inclined, because they know that our response would be immediate and devastating, and that it would not have the effect that they wanted against us in the first place. So I truly believe that this president has once again shown enormous proactive attitude. He is doing what no other president has done related to EMP. I think that the legislation that I sponsored was the first major legislation in America on EMP in terms of protecting the civilian grid. And President Trump was the first president to call for that to be implemented. I can tell you that the previous administration, I'm very familiar with their inaction on the subject. And so I think we're headed in a good direction. I think it's incumbent upon the administration to act quickly to implement the president's executive order.
If we look back in history, Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons on the Kurds, and it was really, really very tragic. Yeah. And this happened during your time in Congress, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Right. So there's a big threat. There's an issue of chemical weapons, and the problem with using chemical weapons that we have to be that the user has to be careful about is, as they use it, if the winds change, you could very well damage those or hurt your very own people. However, so that's with chemical weapons, and we saw that they used it as well. Part of the problem with biological weapons and biological warfare is it's very hard to control. So unlike chemical weapons, where the guy who is making the order or giving the order can be 300, 400, 500, 1,000 miles away and therefore unaffected, biological warfare makes things a little bit trickier, because You never know who's touching who and who's connecting to who, and therefore you really can contract. It's a little bit. I think that's an official term. You know, there are a lot of.
If it is very official.
Exactly, and you know, we going back to the initial, to an earlier part of our conversation, where we talk about the problem with social media, is where so much of what we now know is anecdotal and has no factual basis. But but people have been discussing this, and I want to hear what your take is on this, because you've been at the forefront of dealing with these types of issues, of concerns.
Well,
how concerned should we be that this is a biological warfare from China, intentional biological warfare, versus it just happened due to error or due to any number of issues?
Well, I mean, certainly it's important to say right at the outset that biological warfare is one of the most insidious and dangerous concepts that mankind has ever come up with. And you are right, it has tremendous implications for user and the target. And it's a very frightening thing. You know, we've done a great deal in terms of trying to create a world community policy against it, even though I think it's always vital for the United States to maintain our complete sovereignty in those situations so that we can act in the best interest of the United States no matter what. But biological warfare is a terrible, ugly, monstrous kind of warfare that has implications beyond my ability really to project. And I think it's important that we deal with it, you know, with that in mind. But yes, I think that there are countries, certainly the terrorists themselves, I think that should be one of our most vigilant focuses, is to make sure that terrorists don't gain access to something like COVID, where it can be weaponized even further. And now you ask for a moment, is it my opinion that COVID itself, COVID-19, is a biologically engineered weapon, that it was meant to be a weapon?
Could it be? I didn't say is it.
No. Well, yeah, I would say, I would try to answer both questions.
Sure.
First of all, as you know, I don't think it is. I think it's something that the best technology, the best science that we have, we can't see any gene splicing indications in the virus. We can't see any indication that the virus was not mutated other than naturally.
Right.
But with that said, this is a virus that I am convinced could be grown in cell lines and could be weaponized. And that's something that we need to make sure that terrorists don't gain access to, because it's not nearly as complex of technology or any sort of a knowledge base as, say, something like building nuclear weapons. It's even nuclear weapons, once the person has, or the group has, fissile material, it's a lot easier than some of us would like to think.
Right.
But the truth is that biological warfare, I think, could be something that terrorists would exploit in a very hideous way, and we need to be vigilant and make sure they don't.
What can Congress do, or what could our government do in order to be proactive? You know, one of the things that I talk about on almost every single one of my conversations that I have is that U.S. policy is never proactive. We always have a reactionary policy, and quite frankly, and when I was working on a number of years back on certain projects or certain policies with the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, then at Royce, where I was working with some of the staffers some of the committee staffers, and the chairman loved what we were talking about, and he was involved in this, but yet the staffer looks at it and goes, you know, Ellie, this just won't work. And I said, why won't it work? And they said, and this is a phrase that I ultimately coined based on his comments, is it's just too damn hard. And I ultimately created this, when I give speeches, I talk about the too damn hard caucus in Congress, where we can't do it because it's just too damn hard. using his words. The question becomes as we take a look at this, and again, this is purely from a national security standpoint. I'm not looking at it from a healthcare perspective, so please keep that in mind when you respond. Is from a governmental perspective, and governmental, I'm not talking about DOD, I'm talking about from a policy side of things, whether it's Congress, the administration, and so on, is what can we do to be more proactive to these threats that may arise?
Well, I mean, we use human intelligence and signal intelligence and all kinds of intelligence and surveillance to try to ascertain the world about us and what the threats it might contain. And I'm just of the opinion that we need to put more resources and more focus on making sure that biological warfare doesn't rear its ugly head and become a greater threat to us than some of the other dangers. And you know, starting out, you just put more budget towards the human intelligence. You learn more what's happening in the world, and then when you ascertain that there's, you know, a laboratory in some place like Wuhan, you have more focus, more interaction with that government. In other words, more being able to hold them accountable, and then you keep an eye out for any movement where terrorists are trying to access those technologies, or those knowledge bases, because it's a very serious thing. And I'm convinced that, you know, if America puts her mind to it, that at least we can at least prioritize. And that's what it really comes down to. The too damn hard caucus that you mentioned, sometimes they're talking about the political difficulty rather than some of the other components of it. And fundamentally, we should consider every threat based on its potential, its capacity to hurt us, and based on whose hands it's in and what their intent might be. And that then we should allocate whatever resources we have. And I'm the first to suggest to you that in every dynamic I've ever tried to consider, that there is a limited amount of resources. That's always the case. But we need to take that and make sure that we allocate that according to priority and not political overlay. And that's my biggest concern, that we sometimes do. We consider these things based on their policy or based on their ideology or their political correctness, which is the greatest sin of all, really, rather than their implications for the national security of the people and the nation, the United States of America.
I have two final questions for you, but looking at Congress as a whole, in other words, both houses, I'm trying to keep this as nonpartisan as possible. We have a Democrat House and a Republican Senate. Overall, how is Congress, how do you believe, from your perspective as a former member of Congress, how do you believe Congress is handling this coronavirus situation?
Well, I mean, I'm answering as a Republican, but also trying to answer the substance of your question. And the truth is, even a casual observer can see that Nancy Pelosi has politicized this to a profound degree and exploited it in every way that she possibly could for political purposes, and also to carry other policy issues of the ones that she wants to carry forward, trying to ride the coronavirus tragedy to carry some of these other issues. In the response package, the economic package, she put a lot of things in there that have nothing to do with COVID, because right. She knew that this was must-pass legislation. And I just think that's a real unconscionable thing to do, but she did it, and they've done it consistently always. And of course, the 60-vote rule in the Senate allows her to do that. I mean, I think it was Mnuchin said, you know, we in order to gain bipartisanship, we've had to pay a price. Now, what he really meant there was that there's a 60-vote rule in the Senate, and that puts Democrats in charge. If they don't say it comes to the floor, it doesn't come to the floor. And Mr. McConnell, I've suggested in the past, should be ashamed of himself for allowing them to do that, because he's already recognized the 60-vote rule doesn't and shouldn't apply. It would have been great if it could, if we could have the kind of you know, common interest to try to do the right thing, but it's become so polarized, and the left is willing to sell out the country for the sake of temporary, I should say, control or power politically. And so they are able to use this 60-vote rule in a way that it just completely distorts the whole process. And the worst thing it does is to destroy accountability, because no one knows why certain things are done. Mr. Mnuchin would come out and suggest that, well, we had to pay a price for bipartisanship. What he meant was we couldn't get the 60 votes to get our bill to the floor unless we did what they told us. That's what he meant, and it's unfortunate. It's not his fault. Unfortunately, it's the Republicans and the leadership in the U.S. Senate. Ultimately, it's their fault.
How do we
Because,
change the 60-vote rule?
well, the Democrats will change it as soon as they get in power. If they get in power and they get a Democrat president, as soon as it's in their best interest, they will do it. So
What's
we
the
can
process?
relax. I mean, it'll change, but the question is, will it change in time for us to see some Republican critical philosophies and policy go forward or not? It will break the country otherwise,
Right.
because this very dynamic that we saw, that the Democrats are able to control the appropriations process and what's in the bill by simply saying, well, it's not going to come to the floor unless it looks like we want it to.
What is the process for people listening? What is the process to change the 60-vote rule?
Well, there's really only two that I know of. There are a couple of ways, but there are two main ones, and that is what they call the nuclear option, which is the way that they've done it before. The Democrats did it first. We did it on Supreme Court nominees, and then we did it again on the process to confirm judges and other appointments, because it was simply not plausible to do otherwise. And there are people who say, well, if we do it to legislation, it'll keep going back and forth that way. We'll never be able to nail anything down. The truth is, if that's so, if that's true, and there's some truth to it, but if that's true, then they have articulated very clearly that it's the 60-vote rule that stops us from being able to pass anything of consequence. So the end result there, the uptake of it is that ultimately we have to pass things that are kind of dirt and ice cream,
Right.
Or we can't get anything passed. And at least if we had a clear ability to make a decision in the Senate's a completely dysfunctional institution with a 60-vote rule in it in this day and age.
Right.
And the Democrats had changed that in the 70s to make it completely impossible. If we're going to be able to let the Senate be an institution that can make a rational choice, we have to do away with that rule. Will there be downside to it? Absolutely. But at least then the American people will know who stands for what, instead of the present situation where nobody knows what anybody's doing. And the only result that we can get is the dirt and ice cream that we got even in this COVID time, which again was probably an incredible example that we should point to. If we can't get together to save Americans from a deadly virus, if Democrats won't let us at least pass legislation to address that issue without giving money to Planned Parenthood to kill more children, if we can't do that, then something's wrong with the system, and we ought to have the guts to address it and let the people then make the decision as to who they want to run this country.
Amen. You know, that's an excellent way to end this call, but I do want to ask you one final question.
Okay.
And you are the most optimistic, God-fearing man that I know.
Well,
So,
you don't get it much, but that's great.
as we look forward to, as we look toward to the future, under this current cloud that we are in, what are you optimistic for? What is Congressman Trent Franks optimistic for?
Well, I'm optimistic on just a number of bases, and I'm sincerely optimistic, not just the politically projected optimism.
Sure.
I think that Donald Trump has restored a strong measure of strength in our national security apparatus. He's recognized the importance of the military and how they are vital to the security of the United States and really the whole world. And he has done a great deal. Maybe I would even like to see more done. And I'm sure that's true, but I really believe he has turned a tremendous corner. I see that the President of the United States, having the business acumen that he has created a productive nation like we've never seen before. If it weren't for COVID, even with COVID, I would suggest to you that the Trump years, especially if the man gets reelected, and I believe he will, and I hope he does, because it's vital to a lot of people. And perhaps even to the country itself. I see that we're having a tremendous economic direction that points to high productivity and a resurgence of American power and capability in the world. And finally, and maybe most importantly, I see this president returning the country to its constitutional roots. We're putting people on the bench that actually read the Constitution and apply it for what it says, not what they wish it would say. And that's absolutely vital, because if indeed the founding fathers had a good idea, if we were to chain down government so that freedom could prevail, and I believe they did have a good idea, it's vital that the Constitution also prevails, because it's what sets America apart. You know, what's that old quote, and maybe it'd be a good one to leave on, that, you know, that we just recognize that if, apart from the Constitution's foundation, that there's really not a major difference in our government and some of the others. Our government uses the Constitution to say what the government cannot do, not what the people cannot do. It gives clear rights for the people. And I just am convinced that that this president is doing that in a significant way, and I give him a lot of credit for that. And I hope that he keeps on being able to appoint Supreme Court justices so that the Constitution remains a foundation for this country, rather than political correctness and the flavor of the month. Ultimately, it's vital that we have the right leaders in place, because sooner or later, reality is always going to have the last word. And sometimes it used to break my heart when I would see the left put forth ideas that were totally counter to any factual or basis or reality. So I think this president is tied into reality in a significant way. And I think the last point I might make is this,
Sure.
is that ultimately it's going to be up to the American people to elect people who will do the right thing by this nation. And I think first and foremost, we ought to elect people who will keep the oath of office when they swear to defend and uphold the Constitution, that we elect people who mean that, not people who see the Constitution as this living, breathing document to be interpreted any way that political correctness would dictate.
Sure.
And this president has done that. Now, I'll leave you with a quote I started to say a few moments ago by Daniel Webster. He said, "Hold on, my friends, to the Constitution and to the republic for which it stands. For miracles do not cluster. And what has happened once in 6,000 years may never happen again. So hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fall, there will be anarchy throughout the world." And I think we've gotten just a little glimpse of what a little anarchy could look like if the wrong things happen in this country and ultimately in the world. And it's very important for people to look within themselves and to look at the truth and to elect people who will do the right thing, not who will just say whatever it takes to get elected. And whatever one might say about Donald Trump, he doesn't speak diplomat very well. I'll be the first to admit that. But if you look at the policies he puts forth, they are policies that are dedicated to protecting this nation's national security, to increasing its economic and ability to produce as a nation, and to protect the foundations of the Constitution, which are the ultimate protections in our law, to protect the innocent from those who would desecrate them for whatever reason in whatever way. And so I think that's a pretty good track record. Those are the opinions of a citizen. So you can consider them as you will, but it is important for us as a people to hold on to the foundations of the nation if we want to keep it.
Absolutely. I could not express it any better than Daniel Webster and Trent Franks. So with that, I want to thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Ellie. God bless the Gold Institute and all the good work you do.
Thank you. We'll be in touch.